inaugurated last week, as you know, a series of studies on the life of King David, and this is number 2, and number 2 happens to be the story of David and Goliath, which is one of my favorites from Sunday school. I don't know how old I was the first time I heard this story, but it's been one of my favorites ever since. So, David and Goliath. Last week we were noting that David began in obscurity, shepherding sheep outside of Bethlehem, the 8th of 8 sons of his father Jesse. But his life changed radically and permanently when the town was visited by the great prophet, the last judge of Israel, named Samuel. And Samuel conscripted David, apparently, facially, publicly, to become a student at the school established by Samuel that came to be called the School of the Prophets. But the private meaning of it was probably known only to Samuel and to David. And as we said last week, Josephus tells us that Samuel whispered into David's ear that he would be the next king of Israel. I don't know how a kid of 10, 11, 12 years old processes that information quite, but one thing seems clear, at least from the biblical record: David never played that card. He never invoked that. He never referred back to it as a justification for any sort of claim to the throne. And so it seems as if it really amounted to something that David cherished in his own heart. If we read some of his Psalms, you certainly see evidence that he was referring back to that, though he never explicitly mentions it. But it does seem to be that private message that he cherished through his career. Well, some years pass. David goes to this school, presumably, and over time, of course, matures from being a little boy to being a young man, late teens probably, fairly impressive-looking young fellow, a son of his father, and it seems all of these guys were pretty impressive bearing and so on. And then we hear that Saul, who has been less than fully obedient to God, is beginning to forfeit the great benefit that God had conferred on him, the Ruach Yahweh, and in its place is coming this distressing spirit. And the servants of Saul are looking for some way to alleviate the distress. They know the power of music. They hear tell of this young musician who's so capable and competent, and so this is the next time David shows up, and he shows up becoming a musician in the court of Saul. And then we have a prospective description of David's career from that point on, apparently with the conflict with Goliath in the rearview mirror. So now we come a little bit of a chronology that's slightly out of order, and yet it seems that it all hangs together with this great moment when probably for the first time Saul really focuses on David. You know, sometimes people read the story of David and Goliath and they see that Saul doesn't seem to have a clue who David was, even though already he had been a musician to David, or to Saul. And folks wonder, what do you make of that? You know, critical scholars say, well, this just proves the whole Bible is just hocus pocus, made up, you know, completely incoherent. Well, I don't think so. I think we can make some sense out of it. David came as a musician when Saul was in a distressed state of mind. It wasn't like Saul was necessarily paying a lot of attention to the background music. I've done background music myself occasionally over the years. You sort of feel like a potted plant, I'm going to tell you. You know, you're in the background, people are, talking to each other, and I'm just sort of not quite there, like a record player or something. I mean, it really is true, and I can imagine that though, David was there and doing this nice music, Saul wasn't necessarily focused on one of the court musicians. So David may have rather passed under the radar until this moment. But of course, on this occasion now, for the first time, Saul really takes note of this young man. We have a lot to cover today. This may be a record for me. We're going to cover nearly 60 verses in one session. But it's the David and Goliath story, and it tells itself. My main challenge this morning is not to get in the way. Just let this story once again refresh your faith and stir your heart a little bit, and I'll keep my comments more or less to a minimum as we go along. You won't need a whole lot from me, but the story is, of course, one of those magnificent, heroic moments in the history of God's people that is appealing not only to little children, but to us oldsters as well, and so we'll look at it with that in mind. It begins in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 1. It's the bulk of this chapter, 60 verses approximately, the Word of God. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah, in Aphes-dammim. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He was a scary dude. So let's have a word of prayer and see what happens to this guy. Our Father, we are so grateful that as you pour out your revelation of eternal truth to us, you've done it in story. And how often through the years we've been inspired by this remarkable story. We pray that we can live it again, that we can be there in that moment and see your great power at work through this young man who you use so mightily. And we ask all these things in the one who became the vastly greater David, the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, the Philistines gathered in battle at a place called Socoh. It's in the territory of the tribe of Judah. They encamped between two locations known as Socoh and Azekah in a general area called Aphes-dammim. Socoh is actually a known location in modern Israel. It's called Shuwaki. It's about 10 miles west of Bethlehem, and it's where the Philistines showed up attacking from the west, and the Israelites are responding then from the east. And so they arrive in this place not far from David's own hometown. The general area was called Aphes-dammim. It literally means boundary of blood. It's fitting enough. The exact location of this conflict is not known, but there's pretty good speculation as to where it probably took place. So Saul and the men of Israel gathered together. They encamped in the valley of Elah, as it's called, drew up in battle array against the Philistines, Philistines on one side, Israel on the other. This valley of Elah means actually a valley of an oak or a terebinth tree, which may have been the major landmark that located this. It was probably a valley about a mile across with gently sloping sides toward the middle and a stream running through one side of it. The most popular location that's been viewed as the likely venue for this conflict is pictured for you here, in which we'd have the Philistine army off on the western side and Israel's army gathered on our side of the screen, looking over against them. Both sides are in what's called battle array. They each had a pretty strong defensive position because they were both at the top of an incline of a hill, and it's always easier to defend those who are coming up against you than to attack going up against some. And so each had a good defensive position. They could hold out against the other, but neither had quite enough horsepower to take on the initiative against the other, and so we have what's sometimes called this kind of Mexican standoff, right there in the middle of Israel. Well, a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, whose name is Goliath, from the city of Gath. Gath is one of the 5 major cities of the Philistines, and his height is said to be 6 cubits and a span. The word champion literally means a man of 2 middles. It was a term which was used commonly to refer to someone who would settle a great war in single combat. And so he's coming out as one proposing to settle the battle, the war between the Philistines and Israel, based on a single combat with one other champion who would come from the other side. The Philistines are an interesting bunch. I'm tempted to do much more on this than I'm going to at the moment, but they were clearly a mixed population of non-Canaanites. They lived in Canaan, but they had obviously come from elsewhere. And the beginnings of these folks remain a constant source of interest among scholars who look at it. Archaeologists have excavated deeply the 5 major cities of the Philistines. They have found among them distinctively Mycenaean pottery, suggesting that there were Mycenaeans there, come all the way from Greece, meaning that Goliath could have been a descendant of Agamemnon. We don't know, possibly, who lived years earlier. We also see among them various other remnants of language and so on, suggesting a non-Canaanite population. It could be that they had mixed in them part of the sea people who had invaded some 200 years earlier, swept through, dismantled the Hittites, upset the Mycenaeans, and maybe taken some of them along with them. We also hear that there were among them descendants from Enoch, who was a very well-known, almost legendary character who had wound up his descendants in Gath, and they were said to be giants. We don't take the word giant to mean giant as in Jack and the Beanstalk giant, kind of totally unreal, mythical, unearthly characters, but simply people of very significant height and build and so on, and so they were probably giants in that sense. And in this case, the guy really qualified. He's said to be 6 cubits and a span. That would put him at a minimum at about 8 feet. Maybe a little more, maybe considerably more, but nevertheless, if we take the standard measure of a cubit, it would put him there. If he lived today, he'd be playing for the Lakers, but at that day, his main job was to go out and be a champion, and I'm sure he was a formidable-looking guy in that connection. I was actually there and snapped this on my smartphone, so there the guy is, and he looks pretty awesome. The description that we have of him is intended, calculated to inspire in the reader a certain degree of awe. He has this bronze helmet, a coat of mail. The coat weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He has protections on his legs. He has a spear the size of a weaver's beam, an iron spearhead, 600 shekels. All of it is intended to say, who can ever beat this guy? This is just a little bit over the top, Bronze fits with the time in history. This is the Bronze Age, and so the weapons of choice at the time tended to be this alloy of copper and tin that made a very formidable kind of metal that we know of as bronze. The 5,000 shekels would translate into about 200 pounds. And so he's carrying a fair amount, of hardware with him. He's a big guy, but he's got a fair amount that's weighing him down in the process. One commentator who had a military background made an observation about Goliath, that the man was like a castle with good defensive power, but hardly prepared for the swift movement in combat that he was about to confront. I think 2 or 3 Navy SEALs might have given him a run for his money. And so we need to understand that even though the guy is kind of an awesome character, nevertheless, there's already built into the story a little bit of vulnerability in connection with this particular character. And there may be some application we can make in our own lives in that connection as we go along. Well, he came out and stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves. Let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, we'll be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you will be our servants and serve us." This is called resolving a war by single combat. It was somewhat, I won't say, there wasn't a lot of this, but there was enough of it to say that this is the kind of thing that could happen. The Iliad, for example, has occasions when there's proposals of resolving a conflict based on single combat. Livy, in telling Roman history, refers to it. One very famous conflict took place involving a single conflict. The problem with it is that it rarely works. Generally, the losing side is not quite so prepared to accept the outcome. And so, just as was the case here, generally history attests to the limited utility of this, but it did represent at least a pretty good show to get the battle going. So the Philistine now adds insult to injury using a highly insulting word that isn't quite adequately translated. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. If we really gave an adequate translation of the word defy, we wouldn't use it in polite company in Sunday school. It was a word that was intended to really be insulting, in a kind of vulgar sort of way. And he's handing it to the Israelites that they can't ramp up one guy with the courage to come out and meet him. A commentator was noting that this does reflect one of the most striking examples of what he called the war spirit. It's not the virtue of the cause, it's not the righteousness of the principle at stake, but it's rather simply what you might describe as a lust for shock and awe, raw power, victory, show. That's what this guy's all about. And this kind of bully mentality, I win because I'm biggest, invariably leads to boasting. Goliath would have done well to read his Bible and learn that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Now, the reason the commentator was pursuing this, because he was aware, and anyone who knows church history is aware, that at times the church has been a bully. There have been times, I wouldn't say it's true so much right now in most parts of the world, but certainly in some parts of the world, the Christian church, at times in history, had great political, military, financial power, so that it could coerce people into obedience, indeed even enforce and coerce them, extort from them, you might say, confessions of faith. And of course, I think we all have an intuition, it doesn't work well. That when you force someone at the point of a gun to take a certain position or confess a certain outcome, what you actually breed within them is the deepest form of resentment and bitterness, and many times you create your worst enemies by so doing. And this particular individual was warning the church never to go into that kind of state of mind. It's not good for the church, it's not good for parents dealing with kids, it's not good for any of us dealing with any of us, to think that we can win the debate by outshouting the other side or out coercing the other side. And the warning was against any of us lapsing into being a Goliath. The church indeed is called, Jesus tells us this, to beat back the gates of hell, but we don't do it with bombs and bazookas. Sometimes weapons are necessary in conventional warfare, but when it comes to building the kingdom of God, we have different weapons. The apostle says, our weapons are not flesh and blood. They are the weapons of grace, the weapons of gospel, and I tell you, those are vastly more potent. And so, maybe the story of David and Goliath is designed to remind us that there is a better weaponry at our disposal than Goliath had dreamt of. Well, David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons. The man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Jesse is said to be old, advanced in years, but arithmetic suggests he was probably about 60 years old. I'm almost 70. And some of you have got me beat on that number as well. So I don't know what that makes us, but old and advanced in years at least, I guess. We met the three sons of Jesse last week, Eliab, the oldest. All of these impressive young men, of course, Abinadab, Shammah. So we have again a mention of them. David was said to have gone and returned to Saul. This is probably acknowledging that David had already had a role as a court musician for Saul earlier. This is not going back and forth to the battlefield that's being referred to here, but rather a kind of ongoing relationship suggested by the language. So even though the stories on the face of it appear to be a little inconsistent, I think we have a subtle indication that this is the way it actually happened, and so we don't need to be concerned that somehow we're just dealing with unreconcilable differences here. Saul certainly didn't recognize David, at least didn't recognize him the way that he might have earlier. David is in different dress now and coming off in a different kind of station, so for whatever reasons, obviously Saul didn't quite put it together immediately. Well, the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Meantime, Jesse said to his son David, "Okay, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers in the camp, carry these cheeses to the captain of their 1,000. See how your brothers are doing. Bring back news of them. Saul and they and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah," telling David where he can find them, apparently a well-known location. And so off he goes. This is the way armies were provisioned in those days. Logistical supplies were provided from the home front, so they would send out couriers back and forth who would make this kind of effort to provide for them. And so the Philistines had the same thing going on. They were getting supplies, presumably from their homes as well. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army, meaning to the front line, and came and greeted his brothers. These guys rolled out of bed every morning, brushed their teeth, had a bite of breakfast, and then they went out and had a pep rally. You see, they were shouting for battle. This is how guys get themselves juiced up for the possibility of a conflict. This is not shouting at each other. This is shouting to themselves. Okay, guys, let's buck up. Let's get ready, and kind of thing. And they had done this every day for quite a few days now. There'd been no battle, and probably the same thing was happening on the other side, but no one quite had the gumption to go ahead and sort of pick the fight and get the thing going. So neither side willing to make the first move, but both sides kind of pitched here for battle. David is said to have run to the army, meaning run to the front line, really where the action potentially is. He's dropped off the goods he's delivered, and now he's going out there to see his brothers and visit with them for a moment or two. So, as he talked with them, his brothers, there was that champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke again according to the same words. So David heard them. Critical little phrase there. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So he comes out of the armies, literally out of the ranks of the Philistines. When it says the men of Israel fled, that's a little bit probably more than we should. It's not like they fled from the battlefield, but they stepped back. You know how everybody wants to make sure they're not the volunteer? And so everybody kind of stepped back, and sees if anyone's wound up in front, being the unwitting volunteer. And so they all drew back. This fellow was so frightening, so threatening, that none of them want to be viewed as the one who was willing to take him on. The men of Israel now apparently talking to each other, not so much to David. David is overhearing a conversation along these lines. Have you seen this man who's come up? He's come up to defy Israel. Do you know what the king said? The man who kills this guy, the king will enrich with great riches, give him his daughter, give him his father's house, exemption from taxes. It's like they're trying to get somebody to just take the bait here. You got to get the feeling that that's what's going on. So David, who has come and has spoken with his brothers now, overhears this conversation and asks the question, wait, what did you say? What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Who is this pipsqueak, uncircumcised Philistine Neanderthal, that he should defy the armies of the living God? That's the spirit of this, I think. David had a remarkable power over his career, and I think we already see a little hint of it here, to command loyalty among people. It's one of the most striking things about his career how loyal were the people who attached themselves to David. He was one of those naturally charismatic characters who just was not the least bit shy and could just move folks, and I think already we see a little hint of it. He's not necessarily proposing at this point that he's going to go out and fight the Philistine, though I think in the back of the mind he certainly has the thought that that may happen. He's just trying to get someone to step up. Come on, you guys. You've got God on your team. Look at this guy. He's nothing out there. I said, the Philistine, come on, he's no threat. They're going, did you look at that guy? Put on the binoculars. You can just imagine the kind of cognitive dissonance that he's creating here. So the people answered him, if that's what's going to be done for the man who kills him, they're still trying to whip up some courage here. So David is insulting the Philistine in a sense in the same way that he's been insulting them. But David wants to remind them that they have the living God who is behind their efforts, and they seem to have lost track of that. The thing that is promised to be done for the one who kills the Philistine was roughly realized in David's situation, although as we're going to see as we go along in his story, it was not without some very interesting jagged edges along the way. Now Eliab, the oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. David is now talking to these soldiers, trying to inspire them to go out and dust this guy off. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, "What are you doing here? Who did you leave that handful of sheep with back there at Bethlehem? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You came to see the show. And now you're trying to start the show so you can see it." I mean, this is his rather jaded assessment of what David is up to. And David, of course, you can almost hear the younger brother, "What did I do this time? Isn't there good reason for this?" So Eliab is the oldest, probably a bit of a surrogate parent to his younger kid brother. I was 10 years older than my only sibling, my beloved sister. We grew up in Grand Coulee. She was the best entertainment I had, And we would ride around Grand Coulee on my motor scooter, and we'd sing at the top of our lungs ridiculous tunes that were popular in the day, like "I'm Henry the Eighth, I am Henry the Eighth." We'd do that. I mean, that's what we did. That's what you do in Grand Coulee, And I was a surrogate parent to her. I spent lots of time, and I never resented it, actually. I kind of enjoyed it. We had a great relationship, and to this day we do. And it was, so I can understand that Eliab probably felt a little bit like he was responsible for David, and David is creating a problem here. He believes David is just being insolent. He wants to see a show. David is on the front line. This is where the action is. In history, we know people would go out with picnic lunches to watch a battle. That happened during the Civil War. I think you all know that, don't you? Sometimes that was just viewed as cheap entertainment. And so maybe that's what David is about. David responding in his own defense, "Wait a minute, that's not what I'm doing. I have good reason to ask these questions." And so you can see the rather human conflict in the family suggested by that text. Then he turned from them to another and said the same thing. And these people, the other men, soldiers, answered the same as the first one. Well, David apparently is creating enough of a stir that even though there's, a goodly number of people out there, somehow the word of this young man gets to the attention of Saul, who's eating breakfast in his tent out there, and so Saul is going to send for him, and David is now going to appear before Saul. This is where we expect to see the story say, and Saul recognized David. Oh, you're that guy that plays music for me, but there's no indication of that. So again, I think we can assume that Saul had just never really focused on David for whatever reasons, didn't recognize him now, and probably wouldn't have, and we'll just leave it at that. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. I'll go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "In your dreams." That's in the Hebrew. You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight with him. You're just a youth. It's not the word for boy now. It's a young man. He recognizes this is a young man, but this guy's been a warrior. He's seen active combat since he was your age. How in the world can you envision doing something like that? So the question that arises, of course, did Saul know David? Maybe not. He'd only been one of the court musicians, or maybe so, but then David had only been one of the court musicians. He'd seen him as a musician, nothing more. I don't know. I'll leave it to you to judge that. That's the most glaring seems like loose end in the story, but I don't think it's all that big a deal. Anyway, Saul certainly didn't view David as a warrior capable of single combat with the giants. So David tells a story. David said, "Look, I used to keep my father's sheep," and the grammar here is "I've been a keeper," and implying that he may still be in that station, which indeed he was. "And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard," is the word there, "and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." So he's been a keeper of sheep. Lion and bear, both mentioned, both were present in that region at that time. Lions tended to migrate up during famine conditions in Africa. They'd come through Egypt and were in fact at least part of the landscape in Israel at that time, sometimes more than others, but nevertheless we have good reason to believe that, not only from the biblical record but from elsewhere as well. There were also bears occasionally. The Old Testament tells us that, and again we have other evidence that that would be the case. So it's not out of hand unlikely that either of those creatures would have been out there and been a threat to a guy that's herding sheep out in the outback, as it were. He says this animal rose against him. That would be more descriptive of a bear. I'm told, and I am way outside my pay grade at this point, that the weakest, the most vulnerable part of a bear's anatomy is its head. Now, some of you I know have wrestled with bears, like Davy Crockett, so maybe you can correct us later, but at least one commentator said that, and I'm willing to accept it. And so the story, as it unfolds, is that David rescued this lamb, and when the bear turned on him, he grabbed it, the Septuagint version says, by the throat, and struck it smartly then with this staff. That would be it. On the face of it, I don't know how you do that. You know, I'm just going to admit that on the face of it, that seems unlikely, and I don't think I'd have the guts to, take on that little conflict. But David, remember, when Samuel anointed him, we hear that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. The Ruach Yahweh came upon him, just as it had come on Samson, who was also said to have torn apart a lion as if it were a young goat. A kind of supernatural warrior competence. Now, God has given us the Ruach Yahweh, but probably not for those purposes. It's the same power, but for a different end, you see. But David was anointed to be, among other things, a warrior. And the evidence from the Bible is that he was a spectacularly effective warrior against great, overwhelming odds. And so if we're going to take the biblical witness seriously, then I think we can at least allow that the power that had come on David at that point was not simply a power to be a poet or a king, but a warrior. And that filled with that power, he, like Samson, was able to respond to a wild animal and best that animal at its own game. And David was aware of that. Now, I don't think David was prepared when he first came to the front line to volunteer to go fight this Philistine, but he was sure prepared to do it if necessary, because he knew something of what God was doing in his heart. So I think whatever else we make of this description, something of that has to be borne in mind. He doesn't tell us how he dealt with the lion. This seems to be the conflict with the bear that is described by David. But one way or another, David reaches this conclusion: the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, wow. And he gives him an official commission. Go, and Yahweh be with you. It was necessary that the king authorize this because this was in fact single combat. And so, in a sense, it's a little bit of courage on Saul's part, because at least on the face of it, if David loses, Israel becomes slaves to the Philistines. Now, what actually may have happened one way or another, we don't know, but that was certainly the stated arrangement, and Saul is more or less tacitly acknowledging that. But he was moved by David's confidence and the story he told, and I think Saul thought, who knows? Maybe this is something that, God is going to do here. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he'd not tested them. So the king's armor was probably the best available. This was the most first-class, top-drawer equipment available to anybody there, and so Saul wants to make sure this fellow has every possible advantage. But of course, David put him on. He'd never worn this stuff before. We don't know how it fit, but we certainly know that as he began to try to maneuver and conduct himself as a soldier, that he felt he'd probably be no better off than Goliath was there, under 200 pounds of coats of mail and that sort of thing. David obviously preferred agility to the more lumbering, slow-moving Goliath with all of his equipment, and so he declined it. David said, I cannot walk with these. I haven't tested them. I haven't practiced with them. I don't want them. David took them off. He took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. And if the location I showed you earlier is indeed where it took place, there is a little stream that runs to this day with a lot of smooth stones in it, and so it could very well be that that was the location. He put them in his shepherd's bag in a pouch, which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near the Philistines. One commentator raised the question, how come David took 5 stones? There's only one giant. But then he said maybe it was for the 4 brothers of Goliath, so who knows? But that the Bible doesn't say that. We don't know. Maybe he was hedging his bets. But anyway, he had 5 stones loaded and ready to go. He had his sling in his hand. The sling, as you know, can be a formidable weapon, and those who were skilled in its use were considered an awesome and fierce kind of attacking force in the ancient world. And so we are, of course, again dealing with something that certainly has some facial credibility. What's interesting is we never hear again of David using a sling in connection with a battle. This is the only time that he ever uses a sling, but apparently he'd practiced with it and was pretty competent in its use. So here we are. The Philistine came and began drawing near to David. And the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. For he was only a youth, ruddy, good-looking. The Philistine said, what am I, a dog? You come out with me your sticks? The Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said, slap talk, you come here. I'm going to feed you to the birds and to the animals before this day's over. The Septuagint says that he said, you come at me with sticks and stones. That may have been in better Hebrew manuscripts, so we'll allow that either way. When it says he cursed him by his gods, it's actually singular in Hebrew. He cursed him by his God. And that probably refers to Goliath's tutelary deity, as it's called, the special patron that was the one that was supposed to oversee Goliath, the one to whom he had probably made sacrifices that very morning, the one who was supposed to be the special protector and so on of Goliath. And so it was probably that god in particular. We don't know who it was, but nevertheless he appeals to that one and uses that as a basis for cursing David, who he believes is no match for him and his God. Well, David has slap talk of his own, but it sounds a little different. You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give your carcass, the carcass of the land of the Philistine, or the camp of the Philistine, to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. And all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hand. So David does not appear to be very intimidated. He only mentions Goliath's offensive weapons: sword, spear, javelin. He only mentions his offensive weapon as he saw it, the Lord of hosts. He doesn't mention his slingshot. He mentions the only weapon that he really cares about, the greatly superior one. It is the singular of the word carcass. It's very dramatic. We're going to leave the carcass of the Philistine camp out here. Kind of a powerful and dramatic sort of force in the way that it is stated. But maybe the most touching part of all is David's appeal to all the earth. David has an instinct for the gospel. We understand the gospel is for the world. It's not our private possession as Presbyterians or Americans or anything else. It belongs to the world. It belongs to the world. And there's always been in the best of the Christian psyche a sense of taking this to the world. And Israel was, in a sense, commissioned to be a priestly nation, a pastor nation to the nations in the ancient world, with the central sanctuary not simply for the worship of the Israelites, but for the worship of everybody. And David already sees here the impulse of the good news that there's a true and living God in Israel as being something not simply for the consumption of Israelites, but for this consumption of the whole world. And so this is interesting. Even now, he makes that appeal to the trajectory, as it were, of the gospel and how he responds. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. It's said that Goliath arose because before these conflicts in single battle, both warriors would sit. And they do this kind of, talking back to each other, trying to arouse each other to a battle state of mind. So he arises from a sitting position and then begins moving, probably fairly slowly, like a moving mountain. Interestingly, the equipment that Goliath had would not have included a visor on his face. That was invented by the Spartans. Later, first time in history, we find that big nose piece, you may recall from photos you've seen, of the protection. I don't know if they took a lesson from Goliath, and that's how they figured this out. But anyway, that did leave one little vulnerable part. Just like that bear had a vulnerable head, Goliath here had a vulnerable head. So we hear that David let fly this stone, struck the Philistine. A sling can be used with great accuracy. There was a History Channel show, I watched it was some years back, in which they actually took up the hypothetical question, could David have killed a giant with a sling and a stone? And they gathered some of the better and more proficient slingsters? I don't know, but and they, I'll tell you, it was convincing to everybody These guys at several yards, maybe 20 yards distance, could hurl a stone and hit something the size of a silver dollar. They were very good. And the speed of a stone coming off a sling would be somewhere around 100 miles an hour. Now, I don't know if you've ever been hit in the head with a rock coming at you at 100 miles an hour, but that will leave a dent, you see. And there's no hyperbole here when it says the stone sank into his forehead. He had a headache for sure, but probably worse. Knocked him out cold, maybe killed him. The text is actually slightly ambiguous on that, but one way or another, Goliath was at least stunned, fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. This phrase, he killed him with a sling and a stone, is intended by the author to create for us the impression this was one extraordinary and unexpected victory. Goliath was killed, it says earlier in that paragraph, with a stone, and later in the paragraph by the sword. Don't know which one killed him. I don't know if David knew which one killed him, but he made sure that the job was done by the time he was through. And so we reach this inevitable conclusion. He takes a sword from Goliath, because the weapons of our warfare differ from the weapons of the world, one commentator remarked. And so he uses the weapon of the enemy against the enemy. There's been many interesting occasions in biblical history and in church history where the wicked have dug a pit for themselves, though they intended it for their enemies. King Henry VIII chased William Tyndale around the world for committing that horrible crime of translating the Bible out of Greek and Hebrew into English, and eventually was able to catch him, and he was burned at the stake. And the last words, of course, of William Tyndale were these: "God, open the eyes of the King of England." And unwittingly, Henry, 2 years later, authorized the distribution of the Tyndale Bible throughout England. He regretted it from that day on, because from that day on, that Bible became ubiquitous. It was in every church. Homes had it, and people were debating the contents of the Bible everywhere from the seminaries to the bar rooms. They were reading the Bible, and they were, and many people believe, many historians would argue, that the real beginning of the Protestant Reformation, the beginning of the Puritan movement in England, was when Henry VIII opened the door to the Bible translated by his worst enemy. We see that in history on many occasions, and something like that may be suggested for us here. Well, David cuts off the head of this guy. The ultimate proof, carrying out a motif that runs through the scripture of crushing the head. The proto-evangelion of Genesis 3:15 says, "He will bruise his heel, but he will crush his head." And that is, of course, predicting the work of Messiah, crushing the head of Satan, the serpent, in that occasion. But in the Old Testament, we find a variety of occasions where the head is crushed dramatically. Jael, this brave woman, puts a tent spike through the head of Sisera, the man who was resisting Barak and Deborah, you recall, crushing the head. If you read and look for that, you'll find many occasions when that motif is carried out. This is one of them. The head is crushed, kind of carrying forward for us, renewing once again that great coming vision of the work of Messiah at the cross. Here, Goliath is called their champion, but it's a different word now. It's the word that actually means hero. Their hero is dead. And so the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley to the gates of Ekron, another of the Philistine cities. The wounded of the Philistines fell along the road as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. Israel and Judah are always named separately because there's always a little tension between them. The united monarchy, as you know, eventually becomes the divided monarchy along that line. They chased them to the gates of Ekron, that's the northernmost and most distant city of the Philistines, through a region of Israelite territory. Then the Israelites returned to the camp of the Philistines and plunder their goods because, of course, they all left in a panic. David, for his part, took the head, the trophy, as it were, of this Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. And he put his armor in his tent. Jerusalem doesn't belong to the Israelites yet. It's called Jebus. It's inhabited by the Jebusites. It is David himself who will eventually take Jerusalem and create within it what came to be called the city of David. So again, this is a prospective ultimate outcome, that he took this and it was a trophy of his throughout the rest of his career. That withered up, shriveled up head of Goliath was probably up there on the wall, right above where they ate dinner. So it was one of those things that David never wanted to surrender. This statement that David put the property in his tent is simply a colloquialism for saying it became his private property. Well, the story ends on these verses. When Saul saw that David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of his army, "Who is this kid?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I don't know." So the king said, "Look, find out whose son this young man is." When David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Who was that masked man? Who are you? Whose son are you?" And David said, "I'm the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite." So, whether Saul recognized him before, he sure recognizes him now. He was a young man. He was a youth. He's probably 17, 18, 19 years old, right in that. But of course, the impression that he created, not only in Saul's mind, but in the minds of all of those who were part of this military force, was an irreversible impact that would continue for years to come. So the conversation that is described here took place after this whole conflict with the Philistines was over, and it prepares us for the first chapter or the first paragraph of the next chapter, in which we find a warm friendship forming between Jonathan, the oldest son of Saul, and David, who become lasting, lifelong friends, one of the most beautiful tributes to friendship that you'll find anywhere in the Scriptures. So we'll pick up that story next time. All right, Sunday school lesson shouldn't be too hard to figure out. We have giants in our world. Sometimes they're personal giants. I suppose every one of us in this room could name a time when we felt like we were up against a Goliath, of sorts. Sometimes we look at the political landscape and we see giants out there. Political, intellectual, financial giants. They look scary. They look threatening. They look insurmountable. And the story of David and Goliath is supposed to remind us as God's faithful that those giants, though they may look awesome, are nevertheless no match for the stronger man. Jesus said, "You can't plunder the goods of a strong man unless first a stronger man binds him." And we have a very strong man in our corner when we are confronting the giants of this world. They are no match for the vastly more potent weapons of our warfare. The weapon of David's warfare was a stone. I think you know that throughout the Scriptures, again and again, the stone stands for Messiah. He's referred to more than once as the stone. The stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. In Daniel chapter 2, a stone, a little rock, is hewn out of a mountain and comes rolling across the field to the feet of this awesome character, another Goliath, just monumentally overwhelming in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And that little stone just bumps it on the toe. And that great image just is shattered and blows away like so much tinsel in the wind. And the stone, it said, such a little rock, so inconsequential, becomes a great mountain that fills the whole earth. That's Daniel's vision. Something like that is carried out even in this story. This is our rock. The Lord is my rock, my foundation. David writes that repeatedly in his Psalms, and I think he might have always thought of that little stone that became the great emblem of Messiah himself, that was going to be his own descendant. Paul reminds us over in 2 Corinthians, though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. So the victory of God in history is certain. The victory of God in your life is certain, regardless of the giants that you may feel like you're facing today, or that may confront you in the future, or that have met you in the past. You will crush its head. Paul wrote to the Romans when the rising hostility of Rome against Christians was still just on the horizon, but people were sensing it was coming. And he said to them in the conclusion of his great letter, "For your obedience has become known to all. Therefore I'm glad on your behalf, because I want you to be wise in what is good, simple concerning evil, and the God of peace will crush Satan." An allusion back to Genesis 3:15. Crush the head of this serpent under your feet shortly. That was the great consummation of this crushing of the head motif that runs through the Scriptures. It happened at the cross. And as a result of that, we go through our experience as Christians knowing that we're on the other side of that great conflict, living in the victory that Christ won. We're not going to cover every chapter that deals with David in the Old Testament, so I'm going to take up my teacher role here and give you a reading assignment each week. And your reading assignment for the coming week is 1 Samuel 18 through 20, those 3 chapters, and we'll cover a lot of it, but not all of it next week. So make a little note of that.